She was humiliated the very second she set foot inside Falcon Ridge just because of her old uniform, her solemn face, and the paper notebook that didn't look like it belonged to a real pilot. Probably a new secretary, someone snorted, then accidentally dumped soup down her front in the cafeteria. Her locker was plastered with mocking notes. Her pilot boots were defaced. She was even locked inside the equipment closet for 3 hours before a critical simulation exam. No one believed the quiet woman would ever amount to anything. Until the B-2 lost control and she was the one who stepped into the cockpit alone and saved the entire base. She stood there gazing across the vast Nevada desert from a hangar door left ajar, a single beam of sun hitting the scuffed tips of her boots. It was her first day at Falcon Ridge, and already her uniform bore stains from that so-called mishap in the cafeteria. If she minded the filth drying along the front of her jacket, she gave no visible sign. Instead, she clutched her paper notebook, the one everyone seemed to snicker at. Whenever she tried to find solace, those snickers followed echoes of derisive laughter she'd heard throughout her life from people who believed that rank and pedigree were the only forces that kept planes in the sky. She remembered her mother's voice telling her that the world might never embrace a woman who refused to boast, who wore her composure like an invisible badge. Still, she had come here determined. She had passed the gates of Falcon Ridge with no illusions. This was a realm of legacy pilots of families whose photographs hung in the corridors of the base museum of men who wore medals inherited alongside their fathers' flight jackets. She was none of those things. She was simply Olivia Hayes, a woman of 31 wearing a uniform that had known a dozen theaters of training and carried the invisible imprint of countless flight hours. Even the desert wind seemed to conspire against her, whipping grit into her face until her eyes watered. But she did not wipe them. She stepped forward, letting the door swing closed behind her, and walked into the hangar where a line of advanced aircraft glistened under fluorescent lights. Every step she took felt measured, as though she were taking inventory of her courage 1 foot at a time. Outside the hangar, a group of cadets gathered, some rummaging through flight manuals, others leaning against a wall with an air of lazy confidence. They whispered behind cupped hands when she passed, calling her a misplaced clerk. The rumor had already spread she was some admin fluke, perhaps sent to assist the quartermaster, maybe to type reports. Nothing in her appearance suggested the pedigree or bravado that usually coursed through the veins of Falcon Ridge's newest recruits. Even her hair was pulled back in a plain bun without so much as a stray curl, a far cry from the polished confidence others wore like a second skin. When she approached the lockers, she saw the mocking notes plastered on hers, crude jokes about her notebook, tasteless remarks about her old uniform. Someone had scrawled, "Try not to crash the coffee machine," in thick black marker. She silently peeled them away, folded them into her pocket, and placed her notebook inside the locker. The hum of distant engines permeated the corridors, a comforting sound to her ears. There was something about an aircraft's roar that reminded her of simpler days when she was a child sitting on a stool in her father's dusty workshop. He had taught her to read topographic maps by candlelight, explaining the slope of terrain, the significance of wind patterns. He had said, "Knowledge keeps you alive in the sky. Never rely on just instruments. Never rely on just one set of eyes." That memory pulsed through her, now steadying the trembling in her fingers. She shut the locker, ignoring the new scratches that marred its surface, and turned to face the corridor leading to orientation. She could still feel eyes on her back, but her posture remained erect. She had not come here for their approval. At orientation, the lead instructor, a gray-haired colonel who wore his flight credentials with the self-satisfaction of a monarchy, read off the roster in a brisk tone. One by one, names associated with prestigious legacies were called, each person stepping forward to salute. He paused at Olivia's name, clearly reluctant to even voice it. When at last he said Hayes, the hesitation in his tone drew a ripple of amusement from the crowd. She stepped forward, saluted, and waited for some direction, but the colonel just sighed and offered a dismissive wave. That gesture said it all. "Stand aside, do not interrupt." The orientation proceeded, covering the advanced stealth technology used at Falcon Ridge, the baseline expectations, the flight hour minimums. Olivia stood at the back, hands folded, listening to every word. She watched the pride gleam in the eyes of the others, saw how they relished the idea of upholding their family traditions, how they boasted about the high-level trainers they'd studied under. The colonel ended orientation with a pointed glance her way. "Some of you come from lines of Air Force royalty, some do not. But we expect every pilot to earn their place in the sky." The subtext was clear, and the smirks told her that no one believed she belonged. She said nothing, only nodded when they were dismissed. A younger cadet nudged a friend and whispered, "Did you see her scribbling notes? What does she think this is, typing class?" The friend sniggered. Olivia let their laughter roll over her, painfully aware that the quiet bullseye on her back had only grown larger. Lunch in the mess hall was no respite. She found a corner seat tray in hand, wearing the same old uniform with soup stains now half dried. She had no appetite, but she forced herself to eat because she recalled her mother's admonition to never skip a meal. One never knows when hunger will be the difference between success and failure in an emergency. While she was stirring her oatmeal-like ration, a tall cadet ambled past, angled his bowl of soup just right, and tipped the contents onto her tray. The hot liquid splashed across her hand, burning her skin. He let out a sarcastic gasp. "Oops, I'm sure that old shirt isn't worth crying over." The table erupted in laughter, a symphony of jeers. Olivia felt the hot sting on her wrist and smelled the pungent aroma of over-salted broth. She calmly set her spoon down, dabbed at the mess with a napkin, and kept her eyes on her tray. Once the laughter died, she resumed eating what little remained untainted, her expression resolute. She noticed a pair of wide-eyed junior cadets glancing her way in something akin to pity, but they made no move to defend her. She didn't expect them to. The culture at Falcon Ridge was clear: if you didn't have the clout, you were dust beneath the boots of those who did. After she finished her now ruined lunch, she placed the tray on the disposal rack and walked out with her head held high, the soup still dripping from her sleeve. That afternoon flight theory class took place in a long, echoing hall. Rows of advanced simulation pods lined the walls, each linked to a neural feed that offered real-time flight scenarios. The instructor, a smug man with a crisp uniform, introduced himself as Major Ringwall. He spoke as if every word carried the weight of an epic lecture. "Here at Falcon Ridge, we refine the best," he declared, strutting past the pods. "We separate those who come from real flight lineages from those who only think they can handle these birds." As he said it, his gaze snagged on Olivia. A small grin touched his lips. "Let's hope we all know our place." He then launched into an explanation of advanced avionics, emphasizing their complexity. Olivia listened intently, scribbling notes in her battered notebook, sometimes checking lines from a manual she'd brought with her. She recognized certain errors or omissions in Major Ringwall's explanations, but she kept silent. She remembered how her father had taught her to navigate instruments by cross-referencing manual readouts with actual conditions, a method hardly anyone practiced in the age of digital everything. At one point, the instructor spotted her scribbling. He stopped mid-sentence. "Ms. Hayes," he drawled, "am I boring you? Or perhaps you have something to add from your vast experience in—" What was it again? The room bristled with quiet laughter. She shut her notebook and shook her head politely. "No, sir," he nodded, smirking. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Ms. Hayes, but here we only take input from those who've actually flown a real cockpit." Then he carried on, ignoring the flush that tinted the tips of her ears. She kept her notebook closed on her lap, well aware that the entire class was relishing this public belittlement. When it ended, she slipped out without making eye contact, her heart thrumming with the conflict of wanting to prove them wrong, and knowing that the time for that proof was not yet at hand. The following days took on a punishing rhythm of small torments. Each morning, Olivia found fresh insults scrawled across her locker in black marker. One read, "Logistics, not a pilot." Another, "Go home to your typewriter." She scrubbed them off with silent determination, refusing to let them remain as scars on the steel door. In the cafeteria, the same group of cadets lingered near her table, waiting for a chance to degrade her with sly comments. The worst was the day before her first major assessment flight. Someone orchestrated it so that she'd be locked inside a storeroom that held spare equipment. She'd gone in to retrieve a helmet, and before she knew it, the door slammed and locked from the outside. The overhead light flickered, revealing musty shelves stacked with outdated flight suits and boxes of electronics. She banged on the door, calling out, but the only response she got was laughter echoing beyond the metal barrier. After half an hour, she sat on the cold concrete floor, the dim bulb casting her shadow across dusty crates. She had no watch, but she felt time crawling. Her flight assessment was at 1,500 hours. She counted her breaths, one for each second, hoping someone would realize she was missing. Then she heard voices, hushed but gleeful. "Let's see how long Ms. Notebook holds her nerve," followed by stifled laughter. One of them asked if they should live stream it, but the other snickered that it was too boring to watch her sit there in the dark. She closed her eyes, recalling her father's lessons about composure in closed cockpits. When you can't move your wings, keep your mind in flight. She thought of the manual flight diagrams she'd studied the way her mother once carried herself at a military gala, wearing a second-hand dress and a proud spine despite the snubs from society's elite. Olivia let those recollections fill her, maintaining calm until finally, after 3 hours, a mechanic passing by the storeroom heard her attempts to pry the door open. He unlocked it with a puzzled look. She thanked him quietly, stepped out, and raced to her assessment. She arrived too late. The instructor waved her off, telling her she'd forfeited her slot. She accepted it face impassive while a group of cadets smirked in the hallway. She was sure they expected a meltdown, maybe tears, but she gave them nothing. That night, as she sat on her bunk in the cramped barracks, the lights overhead flickering, she reflected on whether any of this was worth it. She pulled out a small mirror from her locker, gazed at her tired reflection, and felt a pang for the simpler days of her youth. She'd grown up near an old airstrip her father helped maintain. He was never high-ranking, never famous, just a man who understood the soul of an aircraft in ways the textbooks never could. He taught her to handle turbulence the same way her mother taught her to handle scorn with measured grace. She remembered one day standing beside a rickety biplane, her father telling her, "Live if you ever have to land without instruments. Trust your instincts, trust the land, and trust the plane. Everything else is noise." She had repeated those words in her mind whenever faced with adversity. In the mirror, she saw a woman who had endured enough small humiliations to fill entire volumes, yet refused to break. Slipping the mirror away, she stood and tested the tension in her arms by stretching as if preparing for a flight. She knew all she needed was one chance, one real flight to show what she was capable of. She had no illusions that it would come easily. But her heart told her that day would arrive, and she intended to be ready. In the weeks that followed, the routine bullying escalated. The more she refused to crumble, the more determined they became to see her snap. At times it was subtle, an accidental bump that spilled her drink, a sarcastic quip about her paper relic of a notebook. Other times it was blatant flight simulators reprogrammed to malfunction right as she began resulting in artificially lowered scores. She'd bring up the system errors, but no one listened. The base command was apparently too impressed with the stellar backgrounds of her classmates to question whether any sabotage was happening behind the scenes. She lived in a swirl of gossip, a ghost in a place where flamboyance reigned supreme. Yet each night after the final drill, she'd stay behind in the flight theory room, meticulously recalibrating her knowledge with old manuals, verifying every principle, every navigational approach, every contingency plan for emergencies. She remembered her father's stories of early pilots who flew with no GPS, relying solely on the curvature of the horizon and the slip of the wind over the wings. She believed there was power in that older, quieter method of flying, a power none of them could understand until their precious electronics failed. At dawn on a crisp Monday, the entire base assembled in front of the main runway for a demonstration flight by a few star cadets. Colonel Wright, the same man who had led that first orientation, addressed the crowd in a booming voice. He spoke of tradition, legacy, and how this next generation of pilots would uphold the family names that built Falcon Ridge's reputation. Olivia stood at the edge, hearing the unspoken subtext, only the anointed ones would truly shine. She spotted a tall, stern figure in the crowd, someone she recognized from a fleeting glimpse in a restricted corridor. He was rumored to be connected to top-secret stealth programs. Their eyes met for a second. He looked away uninterested. The demonstration began with each star cadet taking off in advanced trainers, performing loops and precise maneuvers that drew roars of approval from the assembled watchers. One after another, they soared overhead in neat formations. Olivia watched, arms folded mentally, noting each pilot's approach patterns, noticing small inconsistencies. The crowd cheered for the high-speed passes, but Olivia recognized a missed approach here, a sloppy bank angle there. She said nothing. When it was over, Colonel Wright congratulated them all, then announced the next phase of evaluations. He skipped right past Olivia's name as if she barely existed. She stood, silent, eyes calm, posture unwavering. Later, as everyone dispersed, she overheard a group mocking her, saying, "She probably can't even handle an ultralight, let alone a real jet." The words pricked at her composure, but she refused to show it. She only took a steady breath and walked away, determined not to feed their satisfaction. That night, a cargo plane delivered specialized components rumored to be for a new stealth bomber. The base buzzed with speculation. A hush fell whenever the name B-2 was mentioned, as though speaking it out loud might breach security protocols. Olivia, returning from late study in the flight theory room, saw silhouettes unloading crates under the floodlights near Hangar 7. She paused, watching from afar. A pair of mechanics guided a tractor carrying heavy modules, each stenciled with cryptic numbers. She sensed that the mere presence of these components signaled something significant was about to happen. Over the next few days, rumors intensified. A B-2 Spirit was scheduled to make a brief landing at Falcon Ridge for advanced testing. Many cadets bristled with excitement. They imagined themselves pulling stunts, or at least gawking at the famous aircraft. Olivia maintained her usual quiet stance, gleaning details from the whispered conversations of more knowledgeable staff. In the cafeteria, she'd catch phrases like unreachable altitude or strict flight clearance. She quietly tucked these tidbits away. Privately, she thought of her father's notes about high-altitude stealth bombers, how they relied on an array of electronics that rarely, if ever, failed, but how catastrophic it would be if they did. She could almost hear his voice telling her, "That plane's a masterpiece, but if anything goes wrong electronically, you need old-school know-how." She let that memory rest in her mind like a promise. Finally, the day of the B-2's arrival dawned. The base was tense with anticipation. Every pilot and instructor was ordered to be on standby, ready for the demonstration flight that would test the bomber's updated systems. Olivia took her place among the lesser-known cadets, watching from the sidelines as the sleek, triangular silhouette descended onto the runway. The aircraft looked like a visitor from another world, matte black and menacing in its silent approach. The roar of the landing reverberated through her chest. She felt a pang of reverence, recalling how her father had once pointed at a photo of a B-2 in a dusty magazine and said, "That's the future." If you ever get a chance to see one, remember how much is hidden beneath its skin. The moment it rolled to a stop, ground crews scrambled around it, hooking up diagnostics, ensuring everything was set for the pilot's upcoming test flight. Olivia stood back, hardly noticed, taking in every detail with her keen eye. Late morning alarms blared unexpectedly across Falcon Ridge. At first, no one could parse what was happening. The loudspeakers crackled, urging immediate attention. Olivia dashed outside, joining a crush of staff running to the briefing area. Colonel Wright stood at the front, brow creased, shouting over the din. "We have a situation," he announced, voice trembling with urgency. During a routine test flight, the B-2's pilot has apparently lost consciousness. The aircraft is still airborne, losing altitude, and on a direct path toward populated zones if we don't intervene. Shock rippled through the crowd. People began speaking at once, tossing out suggestions. "Send the drones," someone yelled. "Remote override," another insisted. The colonel scowled. "Comms appear to be malfunctioning. We can't establish a stable link with the onboard systems. The autopilot is offline." A frantic energy overcame the crowd. Cadets who had strutted around all week boasting of their flight prowess now seemed frozen in place. Instructors and so-called legacy pilots exchanged panicked glances. The B-2 was too advanced for a quick fix, and the stakes were astronomical. A crash could cost lives and devastate the base's reputation. Colonel Wright demanded a volunteer for an emergency aerial intercept, but no one stepped forward. They all hesitated, faced with the near-impossible mid-air override of a stealth bomber with failing systems. The hush that fell was thick with fear. Then a lone figure broke from the throng. Olivia Hayes stepped forward, a notebook in one hand, a slip of paper in the other. At first, the colonel blinked as though not registering who she was. Then, confusion etched his face. "You Ms. Hayes?" he asked, voice tinged with disbelief. She nodded. "Sir, I have the override code for the B-2, she said in a calm, clear voice. "I believe I can manually correct its flight trajectory." Murmurs erupted. "She's lying," someone hissed. "She's delusional," snapped another. The colonel stared at her, uncertain. "How could you possibly?" he began. But time was short. The B-2's altimeter reading scrolled across a nearby monitor showing a rapid descent. Another few minutes and it might vanish off radar or crash. Olivia saw the indecision flicker in the colonel's eyes. He was torn between scorn and desperation. In the end, desperation won. "Fine," he growled, pointing to a small golf cart used for tarmac transportation. "Go. If you can do this, do it." She wasted no time. Clutching her slip of paper, she sprinted toward the airfield, the throng parting in shock. She heard jeers behind her, but also anxious whispers. No one else moved to help. They all stood rooted, afraid of failing in front of everyone, and perhaps afraid of succeeding if it meant overshadowing their precious legacies. She raced across the tarmac, the midday sun baking her shoulders through the thin fabric of her uniform. Mechanics scrambled out of her way, confusion in their eyes, as she hopped into the golf cart and floored the pedal. Dust kicked up behind her as she veered around trucks and equipment. At the far end of the runway stood a sleek two-seater trainer plane. With ground crews too flustered to question her, she swung into the cockpit, buckling harness straps in record time. She fired the engine, feeling its hum in her bones. In the distance, a control tower officer shouted something about clearance. She answered into this comm, "Immediate scramble, emergency intercept." The tower hesitated only a second, then cleared her because in that moment a commanding calm radiated from her voice. She taxied onto the runway. The officer in the tower exclaimed that the B-2 was at critical altitude, that it might be drifting onto a collision course with the ridgeline near a small desert town. Olivia heard him, but her focus was on the memory of flying an old trainer with her father, no instruments, just raw skill. She whispered to herself, "Trust your instincts, trust the plane." She revved the engine, launching the trainer into the sky, a swirl of dust marking her departure from Falcon Ridge's runway. Climbing through the hot desert air, she spotted the B-2 in the distance, a dark shape wobbling in the sunlight. The base radio crackled with half-panicked instructions from Colonel Wright, from flight control, from anyone who thought they had a solution. But none of it mattered if the plane's pilot was unconscious. If the aircraft's electronics were failing, it needed a manual approach. She steadied her breath, recalling her father's old lessons. Her eyes scanned the horizon, measuring angles of sunlight and the ridgeline's silhouette. In her mind, she pictured the topographic map of the region, one she had studied in dusty old guides as a teenager. She keyed in the override code on her trainer's console, hoping to interface with the B-2. A beep indicated partial success, then static. She cursed under her breath. The B-2 was losing altitude faster now, its nose dipping precariously. She realized there was only one option: physically board the bomber and correct its course. That notion was insane by standard protocols. But no standard protocol would save it in time. She made a split-second decision to maneuver behind the B-2 match velocity and attempt an aerial docking, a near-impossible feat. Yet the trainer had a small retractable ladder for mid-air transfers in certain specialized missions. She'd only read about it, never done it. But her father's voice rose again in her memory. Sometimes you do what the sky demands. Pulling behind the B-2, she fought the turbulence from its massive wake. The trainer rattled violently and sweat beaded on her forehead. She dialed back the engine to match the bomber's speed. The B-2 was in a slow spiral, dropping dangerously near the ridgeline. She had minutes at best. The radio crackled with frantic voices from Falcon Ridge, but she tuned them out. With white-knuckled precision, she inched the trainer's nose under a small access port near the B-2's underside, then engaged a locking mechanism that had only been tested in simulations. A metallic clang sounded through her cockpit, and the trainer shuddered as it connected. She pressed a switch to activate the emergency latch release on her canopy, then unbuckled her harness. Her heart hammered in her chest. The two planes, locked in a precarious embrace, jostled each other in the turbulent air. She opened the cockpit canopy, wind roaring in. Grabbing a tether, she hoisted herself out shoes, searching for purchase on the trainer's wing. With the wind slamming her body, she inched toward the B-2's underside hatch that was now partially aligned with the trainer's top. She fumbled with the emergency latch on the B-2's side, breathing shallowly as the desert wind battered her face. Seconds felt like hours. At last the hatch gave way and she hauled herself inside, collapsing onto the bomber's cold interior floor. Once inside the B-2, the quiet was eerie, punctured only by alarms bleeding in the cockpit. She rose to her feet, heart pounding. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unconscious. She checked for a pulse, still there, but faint. She gently eased him back, strapping him into a jump seat. The cockpit panel flashed warning lights, the digital readouts mostly scrambled. She tried to re-engage autopilot, but the system spat out errors. The plane bucked, nose tilting downward. They were dangerously close to the ridgeline that surrounded a distant pocket of civilian residences. If they crashed, it would be catastrophic. She slid into the pilot's seat, typed the override code on the flickering screen. Nothing. The console refused to respond. Her mind whirled with every old-school technique she knew. Then she spotted a small compartment labeled Manual Nav. She pried it open. Inside lay a battered topographic chart, presumably for last resort scenarios. She took a breath, scanning the chart with the same practiced ease she'd honed since childhood. She quickly compared ridgeline elevations, angles of approach, wind speeds. Then, ignoring the screeching digital warning, she seized the manual control yoke, forcibly adjusting the plane's pitch. The B-2 groaned in protest, but it responded. She felt the rush of air pressure as the nose came up, averting a fatal collision by mere hundreds of feet. The ridgeline dropped away below them, leaving open sky. She exhaled in relief. Yet the crisis wasn't over. The starboard engine was overheating, and the control panel indicated partial hydraulic failure. She cut power to certain subsystems, recalling how older aircraft had to reroute pressure lines. Her hands moved with swift confidence, toggling switches rarely used in standard flights. Step by step, she stabilized the plane, guided by the topographic chart and her own sense of the horizon. The radio crackled. Voices from Falcon Ridge demanded updates. She took a breath. "This is Hayes," she said, words calm. "I've taken manual control of the B-2. Stand by for further instructions." A wave of disbelief and relief came through the static. Colonel Wright's voice eventually broke through. "Hayes, my God, you're in the B-2. We see your altitude leveling. What do you need?" She glanced at the battered chart. "Clear the runway," she answered. "I'm bringing her back." There was a moment of stunned silence, then frantic confirmation that the runway would be ready. She eased the bomber around each movement of the yoke, echoing her father's old lessons. Despite the plane's advanced stealth design, every ounce of actual flying demanded respect for physics. She guided the bomber through a careful descent, ignoring the glitching screens, trusting the windows and her knowledge of altitude. Outside, the desert stretched in golden hues. The plane rattled, fighting her on the final approach. Still, she coaxed it down with gentle yet firm pressure on the yoke. The runway grew larger in the windshield, and the wheels screeched as they touched the asphalt. A jolt rang through the cockpit, but she held steady, deploying the landing gear fully, letting friction slow them to a crawl. Finally, they rolled to a stop under the blinding midday sun. She powered down the B-2 and checked on the pilot, who was beginning to stir. Medics rushed forward, ground crews flooding the tarmac. Engines whined as they cooled. Olivia unstrapped herself, the throb of adrenaline still vibrating through her limbs. She opened the cockpit hatch, and the intense desert light flooded in. Outside, the entire base seemed to be there. Cadets, instructors, the colonel, mechanics, and that tall, stern figure she'd seen earlier. Everyone stared in utter disbelief. No one spoke for a moment. Then Colonel Wright approached, face-pale, voice thick with awe. "Hayes, you just... How?" She climbed down the ladder, breath unsteady, uniform drenched in sweat. The watchers gave her a wide berth as though she were radioactive. Even the bullies who had locked her in a storeroom stood there, jaws slack. She glanced around at all of them, silent, feeling a swirl of triumph and anger. But she remembered her father's words about humility, so she just said the pilot needed help. It was all the explanation she offered, holding her battered notebook in one hand, the topographic chart in the other. A few hours later, the entire base was summoned to an emergency assembly in the main hangar. Medics had taken the unconscious pilot away for treatment, and Colonel Wright had demanded full accountability for what had happened. Olivia stood near the back as the crowd gathered in hushed confusion. Finally, Colonel Wright stepped onto a platform flanked by senior staff. Behind them, draped in half-shadows, stood that tall, stern figure, an officer whose bearing exuded raw authority. The colonel cleared his throat, voice amplified by the microphone. Earlier today, he began, "We nearly lost a B-2 Spirit due to a severe in-flight emergency. The pilot was incapacitated, the plane's systems failing." He paused, letting the silence sit. None of our top cadets or instructors dared attempt a rescue. Only one person had the courage to act. Dozens of eyes flicked to Olivia. She sensed the tension, the disbelief. The colonel beckoned her forward. She stepped to the front, her old uniform looking out of place among the crisp attire of the brass. The colonel nodded. "Olivia Hayes, you're not merely a cadet here. You hold a rank we were not at liberty to disclose before. I have direct orders from higher command to reveal your full identity." A ripple of shock passed through the audience. "She is a Special Forces major in the classified B-2 program," the colonel said. Gasps erupted. He pressed on. "She has led 17 covert missions under an undisclosed call sign. She is, to our knowledge, the only living pilot to have safely flown a B-2 with total electronic failure, and she just did it again today." For a moment the hangar was dead silent. Then pandemonium broke out, murmurs, exclamations, disbelieving shouts. The bullies who had tormented her looked shell-shocked faces drained of color. The colonel raised a hand for silence. "If any person here has mocked, obstructed, or harmed Major Hayes, you are hereby expelled from this facility and barred from future strategic programs." Startled gasps punctuated the hush. A handful of cadets, including those who locked her in the storeroom, stood trembling, realizing their careers had just been obliterated. The colonel gestured to the stern officer in the back, who stepped forward. He introduced himself as Brigadier Kessler, overseeing top-secret stealth operations. With a crisp salute, he said, "Major Hayes had been assigned here undercover to evaluate our training protocols. Clearly, she has found some of us lacking in both skill and moral character." In the front rows, a lead instructor shrank under the brigadier's glare. Others just stared at the floor, unwilling to meet Olivia's eyes. Colonel Wright turned back to her, producing a small box from his pocket. "Major Hayes," he said, voice still trembling with a mix of respect and guilt, "the entire base owes you a debt. Allow me to present—" But Olivia raised her hand, stopping him. She could see a medal inside the box, glinting under the hangar lights. She shook her head. "I decline," she said, softly, voice echoing through the hush. The colonel blinked, stunned. She took a steady breath, scanning the sea of faces, some pale with shame, others gazing up at her with newfound respect. "You believe the sky was reserved for those who brag and fear getting dirty," she said, each word precise. "I came here to prove that true pilots have the humility to never leave anyone behind, no matter who they are." The hush deepened, like the base itself was holding its breath. She turned, unclipped her name badge, and placed it gently on the edge of the podium. Then she saluted, a crisp, perfect gesture of finality, and walked down the steps. No one stopped her. The crowd parted, letting her pass, uncertain whether to salute or hang their heads. She walked across the tarmac, the same scorching pavement where she had sprinted to rescue the B-2. The desert sky stretched overhead, a vast canopy of possibility. She paused only once to take in the sight of Hangar 7 inside the battered bomber she had landed safely hours before. Her chest felt heavy with the echoes of all her father's lessons and the memory of how her mother carried herself in second-hand dresses among indifferent crowds. Then she resumed walking, footsteps echoing. By the time the base's gates came into view, she could hear the murmurs in the distance. "That's her. The quiet one who landed the B-2 and brought us all to our knees." She did not slow. She reached the guard post, nodded politely at the bewildered sentry, and stepped outside the confines of Falcon Ridge, leaving behind a place that had never truly welcomed her. She felt no bitterness, only a sense of completion, because the sky had been her real home all along. She spent that evening alone in a small motel several miles away, the neon sign flickering outside the window. She dozed in and out of troubled sleep, the day's events replaying in her mind like a cinematic reel, the frantic scramble to the trainer, the hair-raising mid-air transfer, the cockpit's alarms, the moment she felt the B-2 respond to her hands on the yoke. Sometime before dawn, she woke abruptly, seized by the memory of that hush in the hangar when the colonel revealed her identity. She wondered if her father would have been proud. She imagined him smiling, but also reminding her that there was always a next flight, a next challenge, a next horizon to conquer. It was a comfort, a testament to the simple truth that she was still Olivia no matter what others called her. By the time the sun rose, she'd checked out, leaving behind the swirl of rumors and the jagged remnants of a base forced to confront its own arrogance. Weeks later, word trickled through various channels that Falcon Ridge had undergone a massive internal purge. Cadets and staff who participated in her humiliation were summarily dismissed. New leadership stepped in, presumably determined not to let prejudice or nepotism overshadow genuine skill. None of that news surprised her. She had known that if she did well, if she saved the day, the official reaction would be severe. She simply accepted it as part of the system's double-edged nature. She had no desire to return, no sense of unfinished business. The sky belonged to those who earned it, and she had more than proved her place. Meanwhile, the B-2 pilot she'd rescued recovered and reportedly spoke about how he'd glimpsed a figure in a worn uniform at the controls before blacking out completely. He never saw her face. Sometimes Olivia wondered if that was for the best, that she remained a faint silhouette of salvation in his memory. She drifted for a while, seeking quiet corners in small airfields where she could rent a plane and slip into the clouds. Each flight felt like a benediction, a reminder of her father's teachings about trusting the land and trusting the plane. She carried the battered notebook with her, scribbling new observations about wind drift, about altimeter discrepancies, about anything that caught her interest. She thought often of her mother, who had faced social ridicule with the same calm dignity, never stooping to defend herself from petty cruelty. Perhaps her mother's example had shaped her far more than she realized, this willingness to be misunderstood, until the moment a higher calling demanded action. Each day the memory of Falcon Ridge grew more distant, replaced by the simple joy of open skies and the soft hum of an engine. Then one late afternoon, while she was preparing to take off from a dusty strip in Arizona, a figure approached her, tall, imposing, with an unmistakable bearing of command. He introduced himself as Colonel Drake, a liaison for Brigadier Kessler, the man she had seen in the hangar. Politely, he informed her that the brass wanted her for a new assignment, something beyond mere flight instruction. She shook her head, politely declining. She'd had enough of official secrets and rigid hierarchies. Colonel Drake pressed a sealed envelope into her hand anyway, saying that Brigadier Kessler believed only she could handle certain specialized missions. She accepted the envelope but left it unopened. Later that evening, she burned it in a coffee can outside her motel room, letting the flames lick the edges of classified letters. She watched the paper turn to ash. She had rescued a plane, saved a base, and proven her skill. Now she preferred to remain free of their labyrinth of duty and suspicion. She thought of the B-2's cockpit, how the alarm screamed, how she'd known exactly what to do. That moment had been the apex of her father's teachings, her mother's resolve, and her own unstoppable will. She needed no further validation. In time, rumors of the Quiet One spread through the Air Force's invisible grapevine. Pilots told hushed stories of a woman who outflew a B-2's failing systems and vanished afterward, leaving the brass speechless. Some painted her as a living legend. Others dismissed her as a rumor, an exaggerated myth. Olivia heard these tales occasionally, but she rarely responded. If pressed, she would say something vague like, "That's interesting," or "I hope she found peace." Then she would change the subject. She spent her days ferrying small planes between remote airstrips, often for humanitarian supply runs that touched places bigger jets couldn't land. She found fulfillment in those short journeys, each one a reminder that flight was not a privilege of aristocrats, but a gift that should serve everyone, especially those in need. Eventually, though, the world being what it was, she found her path crossing with those who recognized her. In one dusty outpost, a newly minted pilot from Falcon Ridge approached her with trembling respect, stammering that the base had changed drastically since she left. He hesitated, then thanked her for inspiring a new protocol that valued skill over connections. She nodded politely, saying very little. But later that night, in her makeshift bunk, she allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps her father's dream of flight as an equalizer was coming true in bits and pieces. Time flowed, gently marked by sunsets witnessed from cockpit windows and dawns spent refueling at deserted airstrips. On her last flight before she planned to take a break, she soared at high altitude over a desert plain, the sky painted with pink and gold streaks. She let the plane glide in that hush, remembering how she had guided the B-2 down when no one else dared. She felt neither pride nor regret, only a quiet acceptance that she had done what needed to be done. She hoped her mother would have seen in her a reflection of the same quiet grace that carried second-hand dresses into crowded halls without flinching. As the plane descended, she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind shape around the fuselage. The engines droned a lullaby that merged with the memory of her father's old voice. Yes, she was still flying, and that was all that mattered. She touched down on a rough strip dotted with cacti, the wheels rattling as they met the ground. After rolling to a stop, she shut down the engine and climbed out, dust swirling around her ankles. Leaning against the fuselage, she gazed across the wide horizon. The future felt open, unconfined by any single runway or base. Perhaps she would accept a contract someday if it aligned with her convictions. Or perhaps she would continue these smaller flights, each one a testament to the fact that you didn't have to be loud to matter in the vast sky. Her father had once said that flying was the closest humans came to humility before nature. Once you were aloft, storms, wind shear, and infinite variables reminded you how small you were. That memory lit a spark inside her. Falcon Ridge had tried to crush her with arrogance, but in the end, the sky itself had proven her worth. Weeks later, an unmarked envelope arrived at a small post office box she sometimes used. Inside was a single photograph of a B-2 wheels lifted off the runway, the desert looming behind. On the back, in neat script, was a simple note. "Thank you. We'll never forget. Kessler." She studied the photograph for a moment, then tucked it away in her notebook. She didn't need thanks. She understood that the world of flying was bigger than any single base or any single act of recognition. Still, she appreciated the acknowledgement that for once humility had changed something. As she slid the notebook into her duffel, she found herself recalling the hush in that hangar when she set the name badge down. She didn't regret it. Some reputations were meant to be bigger than medals pinned on a uniform. Hers was the intangible grace of a pilot who saved a plane and left a lesson in her wake. If this story stirred something in you like it, share it. Comment your thoughts. And subscribe to our YouTube channel for more stories where silence is strength and the sky remembers those who dare to fly with humility.